Supply chains are complex, and securing your software supply chain is no exception. From the huge number of components and dependencies that you use from a wide variety of sources, to your developers adding their own code, to your applications being delivered to users around the world. How do you keep track of all this? At Anchore, we believe that managing and protecting your software supply chain starts with establishing trust. And that trust begins with understanding and managing your software bill of materials, or SBOM. SBOMs function as an ingredients label for software. And when you track and manage the ingredients, you can trust the components you use or bring into your development pipeline. It starts with verifying the provenance of open source code and validating supplier SBOMs, and keeping a repository of SBOMs to track the ingredients of your software over time. And maintaining trust as you build, with continuous automated security that uncovers vulnerabilities, malware, and leaked secrets, with compliance checks to root out any critical issues. Then, when you're ready to deliver your software, providing SBOMs and continuing to monitor for security risks after deployment, so your users can trust you and rest assured that the software you deliver was built securely every step of the way. To learn more about Anchore's software supply chain management solution, visit us at anchore.com.
Welcome to our webinar today, entitled Anchore Enterprise 5.5, Adapting to the New Normal at NVD. I'm Alan Pope, and got a little bit of housekeeping to do before we get started. You'll note everyone is muted except myself and Neil. If you have any questions, you can pop them in the little chat on the right-hand side of your browser. We'll probably take questions a little bit later on rather than interrupt the flow, but we'll keep a note of them, and we'll try and answer them as best we can. If anything deeply technical comes up, then we might have to pull someone else in or find somewhere else that you can get the answer to your question, but we'll do our best. After the webinar's finished, you'll get a recording of the webinar, and if you see any polls pop up on the right-hand side, feel free to interact with those as they come by. Okay, so onto our agenda for today. Start off with a brief introduction, then I'll hand over to Neil, who's our main presenter, who will talk about some challenges in the vulnerability ecosystem and some changes we've landed in Anchore Enterprise 5.5. Then we'll briefly come back to me and I'll talk a little bit about some open source tooling that we think you might be interested in. And then at the end, if we've got any questions lined up, then we'll cover those at the end of the presentation. Okay, so I'm Alan Pope, as I said. I'm Director of Developer Relations at Anchore. I mostly work on the open source side of the business, so that includes tools like Sift and Gripe and Grant and some other interesting tools that you'll find out about towards the end of this presentation. And I'm joined by Neil Levine, who's VP of Product here at Anchore, and so can speak with authority on our enterprise line of products. So over to you, Neil, to kick things off.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alan. You can just give me a thumbs up. You can hear me okay, hopefully. All good. Great, thank you. Always good to check. Okay, so we're sort of be going into a little bit of the weeds of vulnerability feeds, specifically as it relates to the Anchore Enterprise product, but some of the information here will hopefully be useful even if you're not using our product, just to help you understand the current state of the ecosystem. Within our product, this is a high-level description of product. We have lots of components, lots of layers, lots of functions, but a core part of what Anchore Enterprise does is vulnerability management. And down in the foundational layer, there is essentially two major areas where we do vulnerability management. One is we manage data sources. We bring in a lot of vulnerability data feeds. We gather information from third parties, and normalize it and get it ready for use. And then that use is obviously within Anchore Enterprise, where the vulnerability data is used against our SBOMs that we store in our system to give you, your current status, your vulnerability reports around where you have issues in, your images, your source code, or in your runtime environments. So that's the area of product we're going to focus on. I'm not going to cover too much around the rest of the product. If you're interested, look at our website for more information. So Anchore uses a number of different vulnerability data sources. As you can see on the left, that's not an exclusive list. We have a large number of third parties that we contact as part of our service. And Anchore Enterprise is an on-prem or self-hosted product by our customers. And so when you deploy Anchore Enterprise, you get a piece of software called the feed service, which connects to these third-party data sources. Now, this is actually quite valuable. It's meant that up until now, you've not needed to rely on Anchore in any way for any of this information. We're out of the sort of data path, as it were. So getting access to this vulnerability information, it's completely unmediated. You go directly to the source. You can sort of be confident around the provenance of the data and so on and so forth. There are a number of data sources that our software allows you to connect to, NVD, GitHub. These are sort of the more generic or general purpose vulnerability sources. And then there's the specific operating system vendors, Canonical, Red Hat, Debian, Microsoft, and so on and so forth. And then the language ecosystems such as Python, Ruby, NPM, and so on. So all of these data sources or vulnerability providers present their data, and Anchore Enterprise pulls that information in using the feed service to then give you access to that complete data set. Canonical, Red Hat, Microsoft, these are sort of what we call vendor sources. They give much more specific information than sources like NVD. And so Anchore tends to trust them more, or at least prioritize their data first. So if we have an RPM package, we'll look at Red Hat, or as in this case, if it's an Ubuntu package or a Debian package, we'll look at the Canonical or Debian sources. So those are sort of the vendors that we prioritize. We do the first matching on those. And if we can't find a match, or it's not from one of these more specific ecosystems, then we'll look at NVD or GitHub. But in all instances, this data has been sourced, as I mentioned, directly from the third party itself. Now, this has some issues. One of the benefits is that, again, you're contacting them. You can sort of trust that, you're going directly to the origin of the data. But in some instances, there can be operational issues. So I'm not picking on Canonical here, just a slide. All of these vendors occasionally have, or data sources occasionally have operational issues, such that, their API goes down if the data is presented in an API, or they don't update their records and make those available. There's network issues. The API is fine, but the network provider is down. So you sometimes have very unreliable upstream data sources from an operational perspective. And sometimes customers are alerted to those, if through the logs or notifications in the system. And these issues are very transient, but they can be disruptive. You have to investigate. Is it a local problem? Is it the third party's problem, which can be time consuming? So operational issues are sort of one big issue when it comes to these feed sources. The second issue is data quality. NVD has a very large data set, but that often comes at the expense of, say, some accuracy, such that things like version information can maybe be imprecise, or there's not enough metadata to sort of let you know about the specifics of a package. Is it affected? The Go version's affected, but the PHP one isn't, and so on and so forth. So a lot of this information is not entirely clear, or the data is just flat out wrong, or being put into the system incorrectly. So that's a second issue when you're relying on these third-party data sources, is like, sometimes this information can be of variable quality. So that's kind of like, some of the operational status so far we've had with a lot of these vulnerability feeds from these third parties. However, the big issue which has sort of come up over the past few months was that back in February, NVD, who provide the National Vulnerability Database, started to have some issues. So just to position where they sit in this ecosystem, because this can be very confusing as this diagram sort of hints at the complexity of this. NVD tend to sit at the very end of a chain of quite a complex sort of sequence of processes. So vulnerability researchers or the vendors themselves, product owners, will find, confirm, and discover the various problems in their software. Once they discover these issues, then they will, CVE is an organization run by MITRE, and their responsibility is mainly naming, or sort of numbering, sorry. It's kind of similar to DNS. They're there to ensure that there's coordination around getting CVE identifiers, making sure it's clear, if a vulnerability number has been established, that it's, who owns the record, and so on and so forth. So they're involved in the process, but a lot of people were not using or do not use the CVE information directly. They relied on NVD. Now, NVD is a national vulnerability database run by NIST, another government sort of agency. And NIST would take the CVE record as it had been created by and sort of tracked by MITRE, but would enrich it with additional information and make it into something useful sort of more generally. So here it would give structured data, specifically things like CVSS, a scoring value about the severity of the issue, or just an actual severity label itself of critical or high, and so on and so forth, as well as versioning information with things like CPE. So NVD is typically at the very last stage, but people would rely on this database to have access to the complete list of CVEs as they've all been published, as well as this enriched metadata to help with prioritization or sort of risk assessment. So back in February, this sort of started to go a little bit pear-shaped, and NVD stopped updating the database. CVEs were continuing to be published. There were continuing to be new CVEs coming out, getting numbers as tracked through MITRE with the various vendors, releasing their own advisories and associating those with CVEs. But the National Vulnerability Database themselves stopped adding that enriched data, that the information around severity, CVSS scores, CP information just basically stopped. And this was publicized by Anchore back in February due to the efforts of Josh Bressers, our security head here, who noticed this backlog forming of CVEs, which were continuing to be published, but with no metadata, no enriched information from the NVD analysts. There was a very cryptic statement on the NVD website announcing that they were suffering some issues, and subsequently a statement or a commentary did come out that they had various staffing issues. There were some other challenges they were facing, and that they were hoping to get back on track soon. But this has been now almost 3 months, and the backlog has just been growing and getting bigger and bigger. And so from Anchore's perspective, this is something that is important to customers to have access to NVD, even if actually a lot of the vulnerabilities are matched against the vendors, such as the operating system vendors, the GitHub, other language vulnerability providers. National Vulnerability Database is still important. FedRAMP requirements state you have to use the severity level from an NVD, use the information there, and also as a sort of a match of last resort for packages not owned by a specific vendor. So this disruption continues. So we've made some updates to the product to help try and mitigate some of the issues around NVD having a service issue. We can't fix everything, but we've certainly tried our best to mitigate some of the worst successes. So again, just bearing in mind that this is not about CVEs per se, it's more about the enrichment of the NVD data, which is the key part of where we've focused our issues, but also some operational elements as well, which I'll come on to in a minute. Okay, so what have we done? So Anchore has a vulnerability feed, which we actually launched with version 4.1 of our product, so a couple of years ago now, and we've just released 5.5. So the initial vulnerability feed offered something we called the exclusion data feed, and this was essentially a list of known false positives which our researchers had identified and that we could communicate down to a customer deployment that you should not match on that record. It's a false positive. Don't generate a vulnerability. We've now added 2 additional components to the vulnerability feed that we provide, the feed service that we provide. So again, this is on our side of the deployment, not anything that has fundamentally changing the architecture of the product. So with 5.5, you can now, I'll work from bottom up here, you can now access what we call enriched data, which is specifically designed to address some of those shortfalls on the NVD side. And we've also introduced a proxy mode to address some of the operational and service challenges that customers have faced talking directly to these third parties. So let's go into a little bit of detail around each of these things here. So the current setup of the product, as I mentioned, is that we have a feed service that runs on a customer deployment that uses a direct mode to connect to these third-party data sources. And as of 4.1, most of our customers use this exclusion data feed where you're talking to Anchore to source this set of information to prevent false positives. So that was the setup prior to 5.5. With 5.5, we've now got this second data feed of enriched data. What this is specifically is the provision of information around CPEs, which is the information which communicates which versions are affected with a vulnerability in CVE. So you can continue to get information directly from NVD. They are, occasionally publishing some updates. There is the access to the CVE database itself of like the complete list of all the records. You can continue to get all this information in direct mode, but get the additional enrichment from Anchore on top. And that information has been sourced in a number of ways. Alan will talk about that in a second. And we're doing this in a very transparent way out in the open. So we'll indicate, how you can learn more and find out how we're doing that. But that enriched data there is not taking the place of the severity and the CVSS scores, which inherently are subjective opinions coming from NVD themselves. We're just providing the sort of very objective data, which is which versions are affected, as indicated by vendors or the owners or the publishers of the packages. So first feature is this new enriched data feed. The second feature is what we're calling proxy mode, which is if you want to avoid some of the operational burden of talking to the vendors directly, which has both networking challenges, you've got to communicate with multiple third-party endpoints, or sometimes register for API tokens to get access to that data. And indeed, NVD themselves have had some operational issues where not only is the data not being enriched, but the data they are providing is sometimes not available due to a somewhat unreliable endpoint. With proxy mode, you can come to Anchore and we will provide all this data for you. So we are running the feed service on our end. We're gathering the data from all of those third parties, bring it all into a single data set, adding the enriched data, the CP information specifically for the NVD sources, which have been lacking it, and making that accessible to customers directly. So by using both the proxy mode with the exclusion data feed, you're getting a very high quality data set, which mitigates some of the gaps in NVD, addresses some of the operational issues, and still addresses the false positive challenges. So customer benefits here, as I've mentioned, in proxy mode, you won't get distracted with all of the transient service outages, which affect all of the providers, including NVD. You don't need to register for API tokens. You just need to connect to Anchore. We'll provide all that information for you as part of your deployment. For the enriched data feed, this is ensuring that this NVD catalog, customers still have got an NVD record set within your deployment. That's got all of the latest CVE records, and it has this missing CP information where we've been able to source it. So you can get access to that. That's also included by default in proxy mode. But if you want to continue to use direct mode, you can now add on that enriched data feed. And we continue to provide the exclusion data feed to help you mitigate your false positives, and any false positives reported by customers to us, we can take care of straight away, update in our data feed, and that's then removed from the customer's reports and alerts directly. So that covers hopefully the major updates in 5.5 for everybody here. I'll pass it over to Alan to explain a little bit about how we're doing this out in the open.
Sweet, thanks, Neil. So we're all about open source, and as you may or may not know, we have a bunch of open source products that we maintained that are integral to the operation of Anchore Enterprise, like Sift and Gripe, and some other tools around that as well. And when we noticed that there was the lack of enriched data coming from NVD, we figured the best way to work on this was in the open. And so we've created a set of tools and scripts that are currently in a bootstrap mode. So they're quite early on, and danger, there may be dragons within these scripts. So it needs a little bit of work, but it's part of our commitment to working on open source tooling in this area. So what we've done is created a repository on GitHub. I'll post the links afterwards. And I mean, you can see the link on the screen here. It's vulnerability data tools, and you can find it in our GitHub org, which is Anchore. And the goal of this is to take the existing NVD feed and augment that with some additional data. Now, we're not looking to completely replace the role of NVD. We're not looking to replace all of the data that's missing in the NVD feed. I don't think it's reasonable to say that I don't think we have the size or capacity to do that kind of thing. And so what we are doing is taking that NVD data and augmenting it with data from the CVE5 public feed, and also with a little bit of heuristics in order to analyze the data that comes from CVE5 and NVD to try and match some of that additional data that's missing from the NVD feed. On top of that, there's some human review and human intervention, a little bit of research in order to add some additional data into that feed so that we can provide that to our customers, but also we can provide it to third parties. So we have both the tools available in GitHub, but also the data that we're generating is also available open source on GitHub as well. Now, the reason why I mention this is because what we'd really love to do is to put the call out for anyone who wants to get involved in this process of adding additional enriched data to the NVD feed to join us using and contributing to these scripts and make them a first-class citizen among all our other open source tools, because it's still early days, and like I said, we're in bootstrap mode with these, and contribute to it so that other customers of other products and people who want to consume this data can do as well. This isn't just for our enterprise customers, although they will benefit as well. It's also for people who want to consume this data for their tools, products, and services. So what I really want to do is just put the call out, put the links available, and if you want to get involved, or you know of people who are interested in this topic and want to get involved, you can join us over on GitHub and contribute. Pull requests welcome as always. But also we have a public community Slack, and there's a dedicated channel for this in our public Slack, which I think is linked on the next slide. And you can join us, have a conversation with us, tell us how you contribute and how you think we can improve this feed, and get the best data we possibly can to enrich the missing data that was coming from NVD that no longer is. And you can see the links there. Our organization on GitHub, the main project page is the vulnerability data tools, a set of scripts and tools and utilities, and then the NVD data overrides is the actual repository of data that you could consume. I hope that's been useful and helpful, and I look forward to seeing you on the Slack and maybe in the repo. Back to you, Neil.
Okay, Thank you very much. Okay, to just finish off, whilst we have everyone's attention, a few other things to note, which some are relevant in 5.5, but a few of sort of catch ups on some product changes we've also recently made here. One critical part of our product is that because we use multiple different data feeds or data sources, they each have their own records. Sometimes you'll have a GHSA, a GitHub Security Advisory, or Red Hat Security Advisory, RHSA. And that's actually what Anchore will match on. As we mentioned before, we find the best matching source we can and use that data feed. So again, it's an RPM package from Red Hat. Let's look at the rel feed. Those identifiers, RHSA, say in the case of Red Hat, often have a CVE companion. So what we've done with global CVE references, which is a little bit of an ungainly term, but essentially what it means is even if we've matched on a non-CVE record, GHSA, RHSA, you can still reference the CVE and your policy rules in your reporting or any searches that you're doing in the system. So essentially it makes them interchangeable. If you want to filter or prevent a allow rule on a GHSA, you can do that. If you prefer to use the CVE, you can as well. And so this reflects a sort of a general direction where, especially with the uncertainty around NVD and so on and so forth, other records are often, you might feel more comfortable referencing the GitHub records directly. Sometimes you'll prefer to use the CVE record. So again, interchangeable use of those records throughout the system, as we have more than CVE records captured. Some operational things as well. We now have token-based authentication, which was released, I think, in 5. This is putting me on the spot. I think it was 5.3. So obviously, this simplifies, the use of scripts and robots and other utilities to authenticate to the system. You can register for the tokens using the API or within the GUI, and assign them to roles and users and so on and so forth. And the last thing, again, another update to 5.5. Anchore CTL, which is our command line tool, which can be used to interact with the system at a sort of operations and management level by setting things up, or it can be used as part of integration workflows, perhaps in CI/CD or some other custom scripts. That version of software is that version of the tool can now be downloaded from an endpoint actually on Anchore Enterprise itself. So we release on a monthly basis. So ensuring that you're up to date on your client side tooling is now much easier. You can just have your pipeline job check in to the API endpoint, make sure it's using the right version. If it's not, pull down the right version. So hopefully some operational improvements alongside the vulnerability changes we've made around proxy mode and rich feeds and so on and so forth. So just to summarize where we've got to before we go to some Q&A, the NVD situation is still very unclear. There is a backlog that's still growing, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of that changing anytime soon. The Anchore vulnerability feed has now been extended to sort of help mitigate some of the data gaps, particularly around CPE and version information, but it can't help with specific things like severity and CVSS scores, which have to come from NVD themselves. And to be clear, there are some records still being published by NVD, but they're very few and far between. They tend to sort of focus on sort of the big, huge zero-day issues, particularly in sort of commercial products, as opposed to some of the more generic open source stuff. The Anchore vulnerability feed now also helps you simplify your operations of your feed service. So customers still run a feed service, but now much simpler. You just connect to one endpoint to pull the information down, which is the Anchore endpoints to pull it down. And most importantly, which we continue to emphasize, is that we strongly recommend that customers enable all the feeds for the most accurate results, that the best quality analysis you're going to get, the fewest false positives, the fewest false negatives will come from ensuring you enable not just NVD, but GitHub and all of the other data sources that we make available. That allows our software to find the best match for the content that we found in an SBOM. Okay. we have some next steps here. We invite you to take a free trial, which you can get through our website. Obviously, come and learn out more about the features. And we also have as Alan mentioned, a fantastic open source community which you can come and interact with, specifically around some of these NVD challenges. Having some feedback issues there. It sounds like Alan, getting a little bit of feedback from you, I think, when you're off mute. Okay. Okay, so we'll go over some Q&A, and I can see that Josh Bressers, who's our VP of Security, is also in chat too. So you'll be getting information directly from the fellow working on these challenges here. So let's just see to pull out any questions there. So yes, the proxy feed is only in 5.5 and above. It was actually released as 5.4.1, but not enabled by default. That's the big change actually, which is in 5.5. The proxy mode is the default to simplify the operations for most customers. But if you're running 5.4.0 or earlier, then you cannot access any of this new data. I'll just read out some of the things which are going on there for people who aren't looking at the chat. Where are you putting your CPE information from? Yep, it's coming from the CVE5 database. Again, this is a dedicated database, which I think is also on GitHub, where we are extracting that information that allows us to then see what's missing in effect and get a lot of CPE information as well. And I know the CV5 database is actually going under a sort of a fair amount of attention and focus at the moment. Okay, we're enjoying your public NVD data override service. Will that continue to be freely available? Yes, so the I think Josh has said here as well, continue to be available. We're not trying to put any secrets or, sort of IP around that. The customer pitch here would be, though, that, and this is true of false positive reports as well as missing information reports, is that customers who find these issues, obviously we prioritize the sourcing of that information and getting it into the system. It tends to be on a best effort basis otherwise. But yes, we don't believe that this vulnerability information should be held behind secret doors. And just to emphasize, this is the upstream downstream setup we have, where Gripe, which is our open source vulnerability scanner, continues to enjoy the same vulnerability database that we use downstream.
There was also a question about using the CPE format, and someone passing the comment that maybe this is time for CPE format to move on. And I think, I don't know if Josh has mentioned it, but I think one of the goals, and it's in the FAQ in the Git repo, that the goal behind this is not necessarily to stick with CPE or change, but that's the expected format for people who are consuming the original NVD feed. But if we store it in an open format, then potentially people can do some kind of conversion or translation and provide that data in some other machine readable format, maybe JSON or something else that's, in inverted commas, better than CPE.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Sandeep was asking, do you consider GitHub advisories as well as a source of third-party vulnerabilities? So yes. So our software has supported GitHub for quite a while now, a number of years. I think since GitHub was made, the GitHub security database went public. So that absolutely has been one of the feeds that you can use with Anchore Enterprise. The challenge for a lot of customers with GitHub is that sometimes there was policy to not allow you to connect to GitHub directly. They didn't allow you to register for tokens, or weren't happy to update firewall rules to connect out there, especially on our public sector and government customers, which we have a lot of. This was a challenge. And registering of API tokens, is it an individual account, is it a company account? Sometimes it'd be logistically challenging. So with proxy mode, that goes away. You connect to us. We provide the information, get the information from GitHub and make it available down to you. But just one thing I perhaps didn't mention earlier on is that even in proxy mode, you can decide which data feeds you want to use. It's not an all or nothing. It's not one big blob of data. You can still decide, I want proxy mode for, for the Red Hat data. I want to get proxy mode for the Debian data. I want proxy mode for GitHub. You can enable it on a feed by feed basis. So you can still choose what data you bring down into your system, maybe not bring data in that you don't need because you're not using that ecosystem. But the the default is set to talk to us for proxy mode for all of the feeds out of the box for a new deployment.
But also you can enable the exclusion feed with that, or have the additional enhancements if you want to, or not, right?
Correct, that's right, yeah. So the everything, each one of these feeds is sort of independently configurable right now. So this still gives customers a certain level of control. In theory, you can mix and match, right? You could come to us for the GitHub data, go directly to Debian for the Debian data, and so on and so forth. And yes, option choose the exclusion feed, yes or no. So really no reason not to use the exclusion feed. It really does provide very good data cleaning, particularly on Java.
Nice.
Okay.
I think that's all the questions, unless anyone has any final ones they want to, final curveballs to throw in the final minutes. Thanks, Neil, for presenting all of that. Very useful. And the links on the screen should give you more information. And also, I mentioned earlier the GitHub URL if you're interested in the open source side, or you want to contribute, or just want to consume the enriched NVD feed. If there's nothing else, then I think we should wrap up. And thanks everyone for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. And you'll get a recording of this at the end. So thanks for joining us, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.